Welcome to the Redeemed Man Podcast. I'm Paul Amos, founder of The Redeemed. We're building a community of Christ-filled men who are coming together to not only deal with life's difficulties, but their triumphs over those difficulties. We believe that community is a place that men can come to get together, to go beyond news, sports, and weather, and to truly delve into the lives of other men, to celebrate together and to grow in their walk. This podcast is about giving you inspiration and thoughts of people who've been down the same paths, the difficulties, the triumphs, and all that can be. Today, we're blessed to have a very special guest in Wheaton's head football coach, Jesse Scott. Coach, welcome to the show.
Paul, it's a pleasure to be with you here today. Thanks for this opportunity.
Wonderful. Well, I have, as many of you who've been listeners know, a very special relationship. My son, Mansell, is a rising senior. We've just gotten back from playing the first ever American college football game against the Portuguese national all-stars. So at my house, and I'm sure at Coach Scott's house, there's a lot of excitement around football and what's happening. But Coach, we want to wind back the clock a little bit. You were quite the successful Wheaton football player. You had to have been led as a young man toward Christ to have even chosen Wheaton. And if you would, for a moment, just talk about how God kind of led you both athletically and spiritually to football, which has now become a career for you.
Well, I grew up in a coal mining town in north central Pennsylvania, and a place where football was cared about, where fans were passionate. I grew up in a Christian household where my parents encouraged me to love the Lord since the minute that I took my first breaths. And so at an opportunity when our town created a youth football league when I was going into fifth grade, I was very excited for that. As a diehard Penn State Nittany Lion fan, watching those guys compete on Saturday and then having a chance to participate in the same type of thing was something that I was really excited for. So I started playing at a relatively early age, continued through in middle school and high school. And really just found football to be something that I'd loved on a year in and year out basis. There's not a whole lot of places where young men get to go beat up on each other, and it's encouraged, not just tolerated, but to have a chance to compete in a sport that demands so much of so many has always been a really special thing.
That's amazing. I as an athlete myself, I enjoyed it, but never at the level you guys did. Now, you lost less than 10 games in an entire college career. Obviously, as the left tackle, you are the very famous position and anchor of the offensive line. Tell us a little bit about that college experience and what it was like for you, not only to play the game, but to have the camaraderie of other young men on the team.
Well, playing football at Wheaton was a really interesting thing for me, and I'm able to talk about some of these things now in a way that really illuminates my own experience and makes sense of it in some ways that I would have struggled to then. Just like today, we bring guys in from legitimately all over the country. We have kids who have won state championships at the highest level of football in states like Texas and California and Florida. And that was very much not the nature of my high school football experience. We ran the wing tee. We ran the ball 80% of the time. I didn't know what an RPO was or a play action pass was when I got to college. And so I was stretched pretty quickly to have to learn to do things a little bit differently. But Wheaton's roster is like that. It brings together guys from legitimately all over the country, some of whom are playing in cornfields like I was, some of whom are playing in front of 5,000 or 10,000 fans, and again, those big state championship games. So joining this roster was an incredible experience when I was a player here, and I was fortunate to play for some incredible coaches. And our former head coach, Mike Swider, my offensive line coach, Walt Whitehead, was Bob Greasy's quarterback at Purdue on their Rose Bowl team way back when. And he told me on my first day on campus that I needed to clip some clothespins to my face so I would look tougher because I had too much of a baby face at that point in time, and that's where our relationship started. But I learned pretty quickly that he was going to be an incredibly demanding coach who absolutely wanted the best for his players, both on and off the field. And it took some time to grow into understanding what that looked like, but it made for an incredible experience.
You know, my first experience with Wheaton football, was coming up, Mansell's sophomore year in high school, and Coach Swider was kind enough to give a speech that, honestly, I think I wanted to go running out of the room and hear and play for him. But he spoke specifically about the fact that there were 8 hours a day that made a difference in the college choice and the Christ choice that you made in life, and that there was 8 hours of sleep, 8 hours of class, but it was the third 8 hours and choosing football and choosing to devote your life to Jesus that you all chose at Wheaton that was so distinctly different than what maybe my experience at Duke was like. And so I'm just curious, you've got these incredible young men who've played for you both as an assistant coach and now as a head coach. What is it like to try and help those young men make the decision about those hours a day, just like Swider talked about? And how do you help them stay structured so that they stay not only on the path that leads them to success on the football field, but the path that leads them to success with God in life?
Yeah, that's such a fascinating question. And I think to answer it well, I'd go backwards a little bit. And in the current climate of college recruiting, 18-year-olds, 17 and 18-year-olds are asking me one particular question far more than they used to, and that's about culture. It's a really interesting thing, and I don't know that they always realize why culture matters to them, but they ask questions about what is your team's culture, what is your program's culture. And I think it comes from some really well-intentioned people in their lives who recommend that they spend time on this, and probably dovetails really well with the topic of our conversation today and what you're trying to accomplish in the Redeem podcast. But what I share in response to that is that culture is like the current of a river. It's what's propelling you towards something. It's pushing you in some particular direction. And so the college recruiting process is a product of evaluating schools, evaluating opportunities, and really immersing yourself in what is the culture and what is this culture going to propel me towards? What is this current pushing me towards on a daily basis? And as you find the place that you're going to be swimming with that current, as you're going to be propelled in a particular direction that you want on a daily basis, then the process becomes really simple and you just go there. Well, that's what we're after in our locker room. We want hearts that are pointed in the same direction, that want to pursue real excellence on the field, that want to pursue excellence in the classroom, and most importantly, want to pursue excellence and probably substitute sincerity in terms of their pursuit of Christ-likeness and a real relationship with Jesus. So as I think about the formation of our players through the course of their experience playing Wheaton football, it really starts with that. It starts with filling our locker room with hearts that are pointed in the same direction. And I'd love to say that we have the market cornered on how to promote that growth particularly well, and that we have some unique formula that would allow for it to happen, encourage it to happen. And certainly we do have things that we believe strongly in, but the most important thing is that people in our program are pursuing the same things in the same way and with the same ultimate love, and that's what leads to real growth for our players.
That's wonderful. I mean, that river analogy is beautiful, and it really does, I think. But you can also be passive in that journey because the river is going to flow you, right? And I know that your players are anything but passive. I also know from Mansell that there are quite a few things that y'all do that may not be part of typical college football programs, like small group study groups. Talk a little bit broader about the culture and how the culture of being a man of faith also plays into the culture of football. And by that, I mean the Bible studies you do, the way, just in Portugal, watching you stand up in front of the group and talk about the book y'all are reading as a team. Those are elements that I don't know you see at other college football programs, but yet are having a big impact on that culture you're describing. How do the things that are not typically on a daily schedule for a college football player at a secular school differ from what y'all are doing in driving a man toward Jesus, not just toward football success? I mean, y'all are having life success beyond football success.
Sure.
And so I come and I sit with these parents and I talk to them, and many of them played for Wheaton, and the pride with which they hold not only their children on the field, but the success that they've had personally in life in terms of business and family and everything else. I've never actually felt that very much other places. And so I'm kind of excited to just talk a little bit about how do you guys encapsulate all this success that isn't just happening on the football field, but is also happening because you're driving their Christ walk through leading them in Bible studies, through leading them in small group studies. I mean, I feel like y'all are driving their activities all the time, and that's really making them better men while also improving their 5 a.m. workout totals.
Yeah, sure. So I'd share two things in response to that. The first thing I will share to our 2025 team will be the first thing I said to our 24 team, 23 team, 22 team for all of my time as the head football coach here. And that's that the first challenge of being a Wheaton football player is to root your identity in the salvation that you find in Jesus. And I think that's such a pivotal starting place. When we were on our trip to Portugal, we had the opportunity to come together and worship as a team on Friday night before we competed on Saturday. And one of the things that we talked about at the very beginning of that football chapel is the freedom that all of us have because of where our identity is ultimately placed. And it's that freedom that liberates the Christ follower to pursue what he's pursuing to the absolute best of his ability. And I think that fits with what is ultimately our goal. And that's whether one of our players is going into full-time missions or going into the ministry domestically, if he's going into the business world or medicine or law, to be liberated to pursue those things to the absolute best of his ability and to do that for Christ and his kingdom. I think in the context of the church, sometimes we get really comfortable walking in on a Sunday morning and recognizing the person that has the microphone in their hands on the stage or is sitting down at the organ or piano and saying, wow, that person is doing a great job of using their gifts and their talents to glorify the Lord. But we're not as readily looking for that same stewardship of God's passions and talents in our own life or in other people's lives in other arenas. And my hope would be that when someone walks into McCulley Stadium, they see our guys playing football for the same purpose, to glorify their maker in a different environment, and that too is an act of worship. So it's a little bit philosophical in talking about it this way, but I think what we're trying to get our players to understand is how to pursue everything they're doing to the absolute best of their ability, because God has gifted them with passions and talents for those things, and they ought to be doing them for Christ and his kingdom, as our institutional motto is.
That's wonderful. You know, I think about the fact the first time I came to Wheaton, I watched over 100 young men in football uniforms go out there in unison, and they looked so amazing, but the number of them was almost overwhelming. How do you, as a leader, break down men in a way beyond just position that allows you to manage them? Because I know you also meet with every player one-on-one. You do a lot to connect not only as the leader to everyone, but also to them individually. What's important in your mind from a leadership perspective to help connect with all of your players?
Yeah, I'd say, Paul, this has been one of the biggest areas of growth for me as a coach in the past 5 years, is to be conscious of how often we need to relay the foundation. Every team is going to be a little bit different from the previous one. And as a coach, there can be this temptation to just move on to the next football thing, to get a little bit better at running inside zone, or to have a more efficient way to call things or communicate things. But when our programmatic desire is to see young men walk intimately in their walk with Jesus, and to care most about that, it requires that we have a different perspective on how we go about our work. So we need to do things a little bit differently, and we want to constantly revisit what that mission is and have that inform the way we go about what we do. And obviously that's highly personal. If it's just about the football, then it's easy to talk in phases of the game to our offense or defense or special teams. It's easy to talk to position groups, but when we are caring about the souls of our players and the way in which they represent not only the name on the front of their jersey, but the name inscribed on their heart, it requires a different depth of relationship. And so the time in my office or in other coaches' offices becomes really pivotal in making sure they understand that at any point in time, if they're struggling or want to talk about something different, they can come into our offices and do that is important, and simultaneously being proactive to ask different questions besides just, did what we talk about from a schematic perspective make sense to you?
That's really great to hear. I think back to my experience in corporate America and even the little companies that I deal with today. The reality is that everybody needs to hear that centralized message reinforced all the time. And I think back to successful coaches that I've seen, they say it and say it and say it and say it again. And you almost think that people would become either ignore it or bored of it. But in reality, it's almost as though the more you say it, the more it's adapted into culture. Exactly what you started out talking about. And I can imagine for your team that being repetitive, especially in a world where, I don't know about you, but getting a teenager and young 20-year-olds' attention these days feels harder than ever with all of the distractions and all of the information, and especially with a cell phone. I know that trying to captivate their minds and get them consistently on a single message has to be difficult.
Yeah, it can be. At the point at which they're making fun of us by repeating the same things that we've been repeating, we know it's sunk in. So that's kind of the litmus test for whether or not they've gotten it.
Yeah, I guess there's some truth to that, right? If they start repeating it and can teach it, that's a great thing.
Yeah.
When we were over in Portugal, Mansell explained to me that you all had assigned people rooms where seniors were now rooming with younger guys in many cases. And I can sense that not only do you all as coaches, adults to college students, you're also depending on your leaders within the team to also mentor the younger people. That seems like a great analogy for them as they step into their lives. Talk a little bit about leadership at the level that people may not feel they're ready for yet, because the analogy I'm drawing here is I think so many of our listeners don't feel prepared to be in leadership. And yet they have the capacity, but no one's ever given them that opportunity. And you're showing young men that you can be leaders and that what you have is valuable to share with somebody else, just like we're asking some of our people when they share their story about what Christ and redemption has meant to them can be valuable to another young Christian.
Yeah. When we talk to our players about what leadership looks like, what it means, what it is, what it isn't, I think there's two things that we constantly come back to, that leadership ought to be about influence and that it requires sacrifice. I think that the emerging leader can really struggle with the moments that they picture themselves at the podium with the microphone in their hand, in our context, giving the compelling halftime speech or compelling pregame speech, and wanting to make sure that that's impactful and to be prepared to seize the moment. And standing in front of a room full of your peers can be a really daunting thing, and feeling like you have the right thing to say or that you said the right thing the right way can feel challenging. But if leadership it becomes about helping other people maximize what they're capable of becoming, if leadership is about helping others grow into who it is that God is calling them to be, it alleviates a lot of the pressure that a player would feel to do it a particular way or to get it right. So our charge to our guys is to get started. Leading imperfectly, but being committed to it is far more important than waiting to lead perfectly. So that starting piece is a really important thing. And when we look at the Portugal experience and rooming older players with younger players on the opposite side of the football, it just creates situations in which we're empowering player level leadership. And that's something that as a coaching staff, I think we've talked about for a number of years, but not always been strategic in our implementation of. It's easy for me to talk at the end of practice, and that can quell the opportunity for any players to speak meaningfully into the heart of the team. So realizing when we're trying to promote that player level leadership, that there's a need for coaching staff or other people in positions of authority to just get out of the way has become really important.
I love that about asking people to step up and get comfortable in the uncomfortable before they're fully ready. I think all too often people, their biggest excuse is, I'm not ready yet. And the truth is we don't ever know exactly when we're going to be ready. I remember in business school, one of my professors said it's not about having all the information. It's about knowing when you've had enough to make the right decision. And you have to step into that. And I can imagine that's true on the football field, but it's also true in terms of leadership. You are a father, in addition, a husband, a father, as well as a coach. I'm curious, as you're balancing now young children, and congratulations, one on the way. Tell us a little bit about what it's like balancing life as a college football coach, which I can imagine at least 9 months a year is incredibly difficult. And how do you think about the way you're raising your children, and how does that parallel what you're doing as a coach?
A couple of years. So we have a 5.5-year-old and a 2.5-year-old right now. And 3 years ago, we were probably just surviving diapers and sleepless nights and things like that. So I don't know that I was always thinking about this quite the way that maybe I am now or should be. When I think about my work, I think about my kids' future and what I want them to see, who I want them to interact with, and ultimately who I want them to become. And try to be intentional about creating an environment that I'm going to be proud of when I think about how their experience intersects with what I do on a daily basis. So we have a player who just graduated who's living in our basement for a couple of months while he gets his feet under him. And I'm really excited about the idea that our kids get to interact on a daily basis with a player who has just graduated from Wheaton and get to see a player or an individual, an adult who's not their parents model who it is that I want them to become and to think about life in the same way that I want them to think about it. And so coaching here requires an inordinate amount of sacrifice for sure. I spend more time with our players than I do with my own kids for at least 5 or 6 months per year, if not a little bit more. And obviously I love that. I love the opportunity to speak meaningfully into the lives of our players, but there's certainly a sacrifice that comes with it. And so making sure that they're able to be present for everything that they can be, to come to football chapel on Fridays, to come to game days on Saturdays, to run up to me at the end of the games and be a part of our break and hear the fight song as we're singing it after hopefully a Wheaton victory is a special thing. But the most important is that they're able to see our players becoming who I ultimately hope that they become in a way that doesn't just involve mom and dad describing it to them, but they get to see it lived out.
If you had your choice, would your kids play college football?
I get asked that question a lot. I'm very cautious about wanting to impart my desire for my son to play onto him, but I would absolutely love for him to.
That's wonderful. You know, I unfortunately see that American football is under a lot of scrutiny sometimes these days in certain areas of the country, and yet other areas of the country, like where I come from in South Georgia, it is religion as much as it is anything else. And so I don't know in the coal mining towns of Pennsylvania what it was like for you, but it sounds like from that description it was pretty well a guiding force in life there in that community, and I think that makes it a lot of fun. I think it's Kenny Chesney with the song, the Boys of Fall, who talks a little bit about what that meaningful element is and those memories and those things. And so I can imagine as a father, you want to let your son have a chance to see that and feel that and then make their own choice.
Yeah, I've learned not to argue with people from SEC country about how important football was in my hometown or what it was like to be a Penn State fan growing up. But nonetheless, it was very important, and I'd love nothing more than for my son to be able to experience that.
Yeah, I mean, it is an interesting world, and it's certainly the Big Ten SEC challenges that are happening these days. There's a lot of back and forth and fighting. Having gone to a college that had people from all over the country, I can say just like you, everyone fights for it. Maybe not so much our West Coasters, but everybody else is very passionate about
Yes,
it.
They are.
Man, that is so interesting. As you think about the future of Wheaton football and you think about the future of your coaching, what do you believe is next for you? Where do you kind of see your desire to take the leadership of the team? Do you feel like it's evolving? Do you feel like that God has you right now on point of where you need to be? Or do you think that with college athletics changing and evolving the way that it is, and I know the transfer portal and everything else is changing the dynamics of what was once players coming and staying for 4 years and leaving, how are you evolving with that, and where do you see kind of leadership taking you in the future?
Yeah. When I first started coaching at Wheaton, this would have been in the fall of 2010, I was working in a behavioral disability classroom at a local public high school at the same time during the day. And then I would come over to the college in the afternoon and served as a volunteer coach for my first 2 years. I remember walking out into the parking lot one day in September. It was as perfect of a day as you can imagine, 75 degrees, sun out, few clouds in the skies, but otherwise just absolutely beautiful. And feeling this sense that at that point in my life, I was exactly where God wanted me to be. It was the first time that I'd felt that since I had graduated from Wheaton. And that feeling has not changed in my 16 years now coaching college football. Serving as the head football coach is simultaneously the most challenging and the most rewarding thing that I've ever done. There's this weird dynamic to it in that regard. It takes a lot. There are a lot of needs that the team has, that individuals have. My role comes with helping carry burdens of guys who are in really challenging circumstances at one of the most pivotal points in their life. But it's also unbelievably rewarding to walk through them in a really important developmental time. And so I see myself here indefinitely. And so I feel like the Lord is calling me to do something else. There's not been a sniff of that recently. I don't know if there would be in the near future. But as that informs how I think about the future of Wheaton football, there's a note on the dry erase board behind me that basically says to protect the core. It's this drawing, it's got core written in the middle, and then in a couple of spots around it, it says protect, 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 protect. I think what's buffeting college football right now is a temptation to just let it evolve, or basically suggest that it's so out of control that there's no option but for it to evolve into this really transactional thing where players come, they provide their service, even at our level, if they're talented enough to move up and go get a Division II scholarship or an FCS scholarship, they should and ought to do that. But protecting the core is about understanding with clarity what our mission is. And we do want to win games. We want to go from being a really good program to being the best in the country. But we don't want to round the edges off of who we are and who we're for in the interest of pursuing that. And that requires that we protect the core, that we keep the mission of what we're accomplishing at the center of what we're doing. And so as I think about this year, as I think about upcoming years, that's really what's on my mind, is how do we make sure we're protecting the integrity of the experience of what our players have as Wheaton football players, and not become subject to just doing college football the same way that everybody else is.
I can feel that. I really can. I can say when I watched Rick Pitino get interviewed recently about the fact that he was not going to recruit a single kid out of high school for this year's coming college basketball season, and I look at the juxtaposition of that to what you're growing and developing in the character of young men. It just seems like two totally different goals. One is for almost a professional athlete, and one is for the future of a human being. And I'm just so thankful that my son ended up in a place where you guys are growing him and his character as he decides to become a youth pastor and then head into what is likely his graduate and hopefully doctoral degrees down the road, that he's got this basis of this group of men who he's surrounded with and went through this 4-year experience that led him in a very different way than what you talk about with the chaos and transactional nature that college football could be if it weren't otherwise.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to what we started off talking about at the beginning of our podcast, which is hearts pointed in the same direction. I think there's a different degree of maturity in how an 18-year-old is thinking about who they want to become that's required to choose a place like this. And so it's not just that we need to sort of impart how we see the world in this process and experience onto whatever players choose Wheaton, but we need to be strategic in who it is that we pursue, who values what we value in order for them to thrive in what we're doing.
Yeah. When I lived in Asia, I had an opportunity to see, both living in a country that was one of the safest and most prosperous in the world. I also had the opportunity to travel all around and see some of the least prosperous places on earth. And it really had a real impact on me. I was in my 40s already, but I really think that was a monumental experience. And Wheaton, as a part of its football program, offers through the Wheaton Football Ministry Partnership the chance for kids to give up their spring break and not go to Panama City Beach, or you pick whichever one was your local one close by, whether it's Myrtle Beach in South Carolina, Virginia Beach in Virginia, and to go and spend a week abroad serving other people. And then this Portugal trip that we've talked about several times, you all combined both in doing a level of service as well as playing football. Talk a little bit about these adjunct things that you offer in helping a man see broader than just football, beyond just the program, but seeing the rest of the world and how they can either minister or they can actually serve people who really need to be served the way Christ talks about it in the Bible.
Sure. Well, I think it's an incredible opportunity for our players, for 75 of them, to board planes at the beginning of March every year and fly to locations legitimately all over the world to then go serve for a week. And it's a radically countercultural thing to give up a time in life that's so commonly used to serve oneself and to choose to serve others instead. And it's fascinating when our players come back from these trips to hear them debrief their experience, what they saw, what they were exposed to, and to hear how it affects them. They go on these trips with great intentions to serve and to affect communities and to build houses or to build playgrounds or to demolition this or demolition that. And they come back with a different perspective on who God is in the world that enables them to serve in their respective communities in a different way than they would be able to otherwise. And so I think that one of the coolest things about WFMP is the intention with which our players go into these trips, with the desire to serve and affect communities, but the radical shift in how they are affected by seeing God at work in these other parts of the world. And I talk about spiritual development in our program this way. We talk about the formal things that we create. We talk about the informal things that we create. But even going into a trip like this past week in Portugal, or going into a WFMP trip, we want to plan elements of it for sure. We want to make sure that we're leaving space for God to work in the hearts and lives of our players. Trying to regiment discipleship is a really tricky and dangerous thing. If we make that our goal and just try and do God's work for him, I think we're really missing. And so we want to be strategic with the environments that we're putting our players in, what we're asking them to think about. But in our program, there's a healthy respect for letting God work through the experience that our players are having, whether on campus here or in an international context like one of our missions trips.
Oh, that's great. And I thank you so much for offering those opportunities, because I watched Mansell come back, and he talked the other night about his first mission trip to the Dominican Republic and how not only was it an impact to see the people and to minister, but also some of his greatest friendships in life are people that were on that trip that experienced that with them, and that bonding that occurs among men to be able to do that together. So, Coach, when you think about growing you, when you think about developing you as a leader, who do you look to? Who are either your mentors or your leadership investment people that help you get to the next phase for Jesse Scott?
It's a really fascinating question. One thing I know to be true about myself is that I'm a verbal processor. And so I have to have people that I can be in dialogue with about different things that are going on. So I've started working with a professional consultant over the course of the past several weeks. This has really been, Paul, an area that I've wanted to be again, I've said strategic here several times, but it's strategic in my pursuit of knowing how important this is, but it's not always easy to come by. So there's an individual who shares a similar love for Christ as you and I that I've been working with from a professional development perspective. And then there's a handful of people, probably 6 to 8, who I could feel like I can go to with just about anything. And as a verbal processor, it's important that I can get all of it out there and put it all on the table. But each of those individuals has a unique ability to help me wrestle with my thoughts and feelings and simultaneously push back in constructive ways on how I'm thinking about different things to make sure that it's through a lens that's going to honor and glorify the Lord and not something that's simply going to serve me or how I feel in a particular moment.
That's awesome. You recruit boys from all different backgrounds, I would imagine, some Catholic, some Protestant, maybe even some boys who are coming that don't necessarily have faith as strong as some of the other players that are coming in. I know theology can be something that people get in debates about, but in the end, as my wife says, we're all on Team Jesus. Mm-hmm. How do you navigate both being the leader, but also trying not to be the leader of the pulpit all the time as the head coach, and balancing what are probably spiritual questions that your players have with football questions as well?
Yeah, that's great. Did Mansell share with you about our debates on our hike last Wednesday?
He did share. He started that conversation. He said that players all around were listening to you all communicate on a very long hike. Yes.
Yeah, it was fascinating. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I might have taken a few stances that I didn't personally agree with, just in the interest of debating at a couple of points. I really appreciate the analogy of holding things that are non-negotiable with a closed fist and things that are negotiable with an open hand. And I think that would inform the way I try to lead in this area in the context of our program. And again, this would be another situation where I can look back at my own experience, and Wheaton caused me to wrestle with a number of different things from a theological perspective that I never had before. I grew up in the church, but I went to a Southern Baptist church in north central Pennsylvania, which is an oxymoron in itself. We had collard greens and pierogies next to each other at luncheons on Sunday afternoons at some different points in time. But there were some things that I had to work through while at Wheaton. And one of the conclusions that one of those 6 to 8 people who I trust from a mentorship perspective implicitly shared with me is that good men differ. And realizing that that's not something that ought to be threatening to our convictions, but that's something that ought to allow us to wrestle well with them, has really changed my perspective on whether or not we need to be beholden to persuade people to view the open-handed issues in the same way that we view them. And so identifying what is non-negotiable, being committed to those convictions, but not adding things from the open hand to the closed fist is really important to me.
I really like that. I'm gonna have to steal that. I'll give you credit, but I'm definitely gonna have to use that. I think that's important. I think sometimes knowing what are issues that you are absolutely willing to fight for versus the issues you're willing to be open to negotiating and having conversations around. That's great coaching and great parenting.
There's an N.T. Wright quote, and I've struggled to find it recently because I've referenced it with a couple of our players, that basically hints at the more he's wrestled with both history and theology, or how he experiences life in theology, the more compatible he has found both to become. And it's a really interesting conclusion. And I don't think that at first glance that could sound like there's an insistence on sort of being a relativist. I don't think it's about that at all. I think it's about an acknowledgement of how readily we want to defend our convictions and put them in that closed fist when we ought to hold them in the open hand, plenty of them in the open hand instead.
Wow. Well, Coach, I can't tell you how much I appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to come and have a conversation with us. I hope that we would broaden the Wheaton audience, maybe even just a little further, and intrigue a few people to tune into some games.
We would love that.
The first of which will be against a national Division III powerhouse of the past few decades in Mount Union, as you all travel there, and I will gladly meet you there. And to have them and North Central, your arch rival, as two of the most successful Division III teams ever, with Wheaton being one of them, it is a heck of a powerhouse schedule this coming season. I can imagine you're excited and also focused on making sure 2025 is going to be a big year.
Very much so. We wouldn't have it any other way. Thanks
Wonderful.
again for having me, Paul. I've enjoyed this.
Thank you, Coach. To our audience, I want to say thank you for taking time to come, to listen, and to participate. I hope you realize that we're bringing people that we think not only speak to the heart of their walk with Jesus, but also who have trials and tribulations in their life that can parallel yours, who are helping lead people in a way that comes to a place that God can speak and breathe into them and truly redeem their lives. God is a wonderful, wonderful source and the only source for each of us. I thank you so much for your time tonight. Please go to our website, sign up for our newsletter. It may be an old and arcane way of doing things, but I can promise you it's the best way to stay in contact. Sign up for our podcast and subscribe. But we thank you. Good night and God bless.